was radically, provocatively new. With Cubism, Picasso threw open the doors to abstract art, and in the future, many artists wouldn't even bother with a subject at all. Cubism was a hit with many powerful dealers and collectors, making Picasso increasingly wealthy. The sharp angles and hard lines felt mathematical, technological, scientific, just like the modern world. And the look would gradually saturate the 1920s and 30s, reaching into the remotest corners. Proof can be found in this isolated hotel on its own island off the Devon coast. Cubism would have an enormous impact, not just on art, but on culture more widely. Just look around this room. It's a beautiful example of Art Deco design, a decorative style that became really fashionable in the 20s and came to typify the opulence, glamour and excitement of life during the Jazz Age. Suddenly everything became stripped-down, streamlined icons of modernity. The funny thing is that many of the hallmarks of Art Deco wouldn't really exist if it wasn't for Cubism. You could even call Art Deco Cubism for the masses. Picasso's radical ideas remoulded and repackaged for the mainstream. Victorian interior design had been inspired by the natural world, while Art Deco used the geometric, abstract shapes of Picasso's Cubism. So it could be said that Cubism led to these iconic buildings of the 20s and 30s. It also influenced the clothes that were worn. Chris Brouard from the Victoria and Albert Museum is going to show me how fashion designers also latched onto the craze for Cubism. I get the sense, Chris, that fashion, you know, you imagine the Victorians all a bit stuffy, and then suddenly at the beginning of the 20th century it just takes a huge leap forward.
It does, yeah. You move from a kind of era of corsets, bustles, the hourglass figure, to something that's completely modern. Something like this from the mid-1920s. What's interesting here is we see a geometrical print that's very much showing us how Cubism was starting to have an influence on popular style of the time. And if you look across the whole range, you can almost see quotations from Cubist paintings they've got out into popular dressings.
Well, I think this is a great example, because it looks just like the background of one of those early Cubist paintings, very muted colours, and the way that the forms are there, it's as if they've sort of dissolved into the paint surface, and then someone's seen one of those and thought, that would make a beautiful print on a dress.
Picasso's there in the mix. So he's there in Paris, he's moving in the circles of Chanel, and art and fashion have always had this vibrant relationship, and I think Picasso would have played on that, and I think contemporary fashion designers would have been incredibly interested in how his work was commenting on modern life, which is what fashion does, essentially.
The influence of Picasso's Cubism can still be felt today. Nowhere more strikingly than here, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. When it was built in 1997, it was hugely controversial, not least because it was designed by an American, Frank Gehry. But he was inspired by this, the accordionist, painted by a Spaniard, Pablo Picasso. And it's not just modern Spanish architecture that's been contorted by Cubism. Architect Russell Brown thinks that British buildings, like this one in North London, are also a bit Picasso.
You might say it's the great-great-grandson of Cubism, but you can recognise the way the sort of forms collide with each other and the sort of fragments coming together. And that sort of superimposing of forms is very much from Cubism. You'd recognise it from a painting from Picasso, you know, back in 1910.
It's almost like this is an attack on a traditional way of making a building.
Well, I think it certainly is. I mean, this is a normal North London Victorian street, and this building is completely alien. It's really a piece of sculpture. It's an art form rather than a building. It's takes much more from art practice than it does from architectural tradition.
In 1912, Picasso and Braque made yet another outrageous innovation. They started sticking materials like cloth, or newspaper, or rope onto their paintings. Amazingly, they were the first to use collage as an art form. Then, yet another provocative leap. Picasso started creating whole sculptures out of everyday objects and scraps of metal, like this absinthe glass incorporating a real spoon. Traditional artists had carved or moulded their sculptures from materials like bronze, wood, or marble. Just assembling a sculpture from odds and ends, like this guitar made from sheets of metal, was breathtakingly original. So we've Picasso to thank for the hordes of contemporary artists who've since adopted this technique. Such as Anthony Caro.
Sir Anthony, hi. Alistair.
Hello.
Hi.
He's one of Britain's most acclaimed sculptors, who along with Norman Foster designed London's Millennium Bridge. Like Picasso's sculptures, Caro's are assembled from scraps of metal. Very large scraps of metal.
You can see all sorts of things here you've assembled. Girders.
Yes, yes.
What is that? Is that a big drill or a coil?
It's a coil of some sort.
Just looking around, it seems like you take lots of everyday objects that could be big spanners or those sort of springs or maybe a big bollard from the street, and you transform them by combining them into something new.
Well, yes, that is collage, which was started by Picasso and Braque, of course. That's his legacy.
Has he been a very big influence on you as a sculptor?
Yes, yes. And everybody for the last 50 years, 60, 70, 80 years. Yes, incredible. He changed sculpture completely.
I get the impression that, in a funny way, Picasso's paintings, more than his sculptures, have actually influenced your work.
I think that's true. I have made a sculpture called After Picasso. I'll show you a photograph.
I love all these bits and pieces you seem to assemble into your sculptures.
Yes, a magpie. I'm a magpie. Yes, there's a sculpture, a table sculpture.
And it's actually called After Picasso. Were you thinking about a particular painting?
Oh,
there?
yes, absolutely. Here it is. And I thought, well, let's see what happens if I try to make it into a sculpture. I get some of the same things, like the table, leaf table, which is in all of them. And then that this becomes this.
The baguette is
yes,
there.
And they're sort of there, yes, that's
and
right.
even this fruit bowl, you can see the round form there.
Beginning to, that's it.
Picasso famously was very happy to raid art history. He'd often recycle motifs from lots of different artists. I know that Matisse called him a bandit, for example.
Oh, he was a bandit, all right, yes. But there's no guilt in doing this in art. It's all part of the growth. We're all trying to nudge art forward, keep it alive.
And do you think that's what Picasso was doing? What he'll be best remembered for, that he moved art history forward in great leaps and bounds?
I don't think he'll be remembered just for that. He'll be remembered also because he painted and sculpted masterpiece after masterpiece. We can't speak highly enough of him.
You seem quite moved even thinking about him.
Yeah, yeah, he was something.
The outbreak of the First World War interrupted Picasso's Cubist experiments. His collaborator Braque was called up, along with many of his Bohemian friends. But being a Spaniard, Picasso was not. During the war, he fell in love with Olga Koklova, a beautiful ballet dancer. The respectable daughter of a wealthy Russian general, she was very different to the multitude of women Picasso had known before. They married in 1918. His Cubist paintings had made Picasso rich. Olga was socially ambitious, and together they became fixtures of Parisian high society, spending their summers on the Mediterranean coast of France.
To
Before Picasso, the French Riviera had been a winter rather than a summer resort. But back in the 20s, when he used to stay here with all of his stylish friends during the hottest months of the year, Picasso had sparked a trend. And suddenly, escaping to southern France for a break in the sun was the fashionable thing to do. They lived the dream. Sun, sea, picnics and parties. Picasso's settled, conservative high life with Olga was reflected in his paintings. They generally became more gentle, more realistic, more conventional. But after several years of marriage, Picasso started to feel increasingly constrained by his authoritarian wife. The life of disciplined respectability that Olga demanded began to drive Picasso to distraction. His pent-up frustration finally burst out in his art. In the spring of 1925, Picasso and his wife Olga visited Monte Carlo, where her ballet company were rehearsing. Picasso made a series of really beautiful but quite classical-feeling drawings of some of the dancers. But then, the news of the death of a really old friend prompted the return of his restless, anarchic spirit. The result was The Three Dancers, a painting of unprecedented violence drawn from the deepest crevices of Picasso's mind. Harsh colours, deformed bodies, nightmarish, grotesque. It couldn't be further removed from the well-behaved classical paintings he'd been producing recently. I'm going to see this startling picture with Picasso expert Charlie Miller.
Started off as a much calmer depiction of the three graces, but it ended up as something really wild.
He was completely living the high life. He was married to Olga, the ballerina, and they led this very, very gilded existence. And then suddenly he creates this.
But I think this picture is a kind of turn away from that.